on a very big scale. Folks have talked a little bit about there are projects that are in your home size projects. There are projects that are facility size, the correctional facility down on the Eastern Shore. There are projects that are sort of bigger, that are serving sort of multiple facilities or are providing a load for electricity. There's also on much bigger scales. I know many of you have heard about the poultry litter facilities. The use of wood to stabilize that kind of wet fuel is a use of wood potentially here in Maryland. But also there are much larger uses. The Able Foundation, for example, is involved with a technology that gasifies wood. Fundamentally, you put wood in one end and you get jet fuel out the other. That project is being undertaken in Wisconsin. So there is an awful lot going on with wood, sort of across the spectrum. So when you talk about financing, am I doing something wrong? Okay. Talk about financing wood projects. I'm going to try to cover this in 20 minutes, but there's an awfully big scale of the different things you're talking about. Real quickly, let's talk about what's in your home. My expertise here is not professional. It's having financed my own renewable energy system on my farm. And fundamentally, the best place to look is with the dealers. These guys know exactly where and how to get money. You ought to talk to them, but a couple of things to keep in mind. Number one, if you're living on a farm, or you're living on something that has more than 2 acres, think of yourself as a farmer because you ought to be looking at agricultural programs. If you're putting a wood-burning facility into a business, whether it's your primary business or it's a secondary business, and there are a lot of people that do have these things in these facilities in other than their living room, you may qualify for Small Business Administration assistance. So just keep an eye on those kinds of things, but once again, the dealers are the ones who know a lot about where the money is. And I will say one other thing. I know that there is discussion about whether or not the credits are worth it. I think when you are actually in the process of buying one of these, credits are worth it. And the other thing to think about on a state assistance basis is sales tax breaks. It doesn't necessarily have to be a credit that you take, you use at the end of the year. Some states are using sales tax relief as another means to help finance these. Okay, when you get to the bigger systems, and when I say bigger systems, whether that's a school, a prison, or much bigger, whether you're talking about using wood to generate electricity and that sort of thing, let me explain some of the things that you commonly hear. And I call it the 3 Ps. It's price, permits, and politics. And you've got to overcome those 3 things. And you've got to overcome them to achieve one of the following ways of financing. The first is financing it on your balance sheet. Now, if you're a big company, that's really clear. You just guarantee it. And at that point, nobody worries about the 3 things I'm about to talk about. If you're a state or local government, you use your full faith and credit debt, your bonds. And at that point, you lump it in with the roads, with the school system itself, and you finance the facility as part of a general package of financings. If you're not going to use your balance sheet, whether you're a private entity or a public entity, then you're going to do what's called project finance. And that means that you're going to finance the project on the strength of the project itself. That's the way most of the electricity generating facilities, the standalone facilities you see are done. That's the way almost all of the bigger projects are done. And these are the things you look at when you're doing project finance. First is where you're going to get your fuel. And this is where you hear, if you've heard, people talk about needing long-term contracts. They've got to know that they're going to have this fuel for the length of the debt. So if you're trying to get 15-year debt, 20-year debt, the lender's going to say to you, how do I know the fuel's going to cost this much 15 years from now? Or is the fuel going to eat up all the profit? So you're not going to make any money, and you're not going to have enough money to pay me as the lender. And so you either need a long-term contract or you need a substitute for it. And the substitute can be on a real basic level, somebody like Dan, who can talk to a lender and convince them that there's enough wood here. You don't have to worry about this. It's going to be here. The second thing you can do is get the off-taker, who's ever going to use the ultimate end product, whether you're heating a building or you're generating electricity, get them to take that risk. How do you do that? You sell it instead of a fixed price, you sell it with a formula-based price. And that formula-based price has a component in it for the fuel. And a lot of times you get it's not, the formula can get complicated, but the premise isn't. Banker, what are you worried about? If you're worried about the price going over X, then my formula only has to protect over X. So everybody will acknowledge it's a pinhole, it's ever going to get this high, that's all we have to cover. So these things get complicated because you're trying to address very particular issues. And real quickly, let me talk about where the money comes from. It used to be the money came from the banks, sort of local banks, or Wall Street. There's a new player in the game, and that's the U.S. government. And for about the last 3 years, getting money out of Wall Street has been easier for projects in Africa than it has been for the United States, and I'm not kidding. And so Washington has become sort of as much a player in the finance game as New York is. Hopefully we're coming out of that, but the other place where you find it is equipment financing. And as your project gets bigger, looking to the primary equipment suppliers is a really good way of getting some of your financing. Okay, real quickly, the next P is the politics. The politics in a project like this are something that you've got to address head on, and the lenders are going to want to know that sort of the issues are solved. They're going to want to know that the issues, your environmental, so we heard about the permitting, that component is solved, and I'll talk about that in a second. But in a number of situations, for example, if you're trying to put together a project to do a school, a jail, something like that, it may be the case that you need to address particular concerns of the local community involved. So, for example, if the local community does not want to use its debt because it doesn't want to affect its bond rating, you have to find a way to, if you're going to use tax-exempt debt, to use another entity that can finance with tax-exempt debt. We've got some of them here today. They're out there in Maryland. They exist, but you have to seek that course to overcome that political problem. There's, just in Maryland, being realistic, there's another problem right now with these facilities in that you have to go seek an exemption. So a special permit in order to do these. Some state and local governments local governments don't want to be the party that's actually applying for that. You have to address that head on. You can use some of the other state entities who are willing to do that, or a lot of times the private vendors are willing to undertake it. And so that is a way that you overcome that. And then the final is what I alluded to. The final piece is the permitting piece. And this is something that scares lenders to death, because permit issues can suck all the profit out of a deal, can suck all the money out of a deal, and can shut a deal down. And so this is something that's got to be buttoned down, and they've got to feel comfortable with. And just as listening to the prior speaker, when you hear about the government saying, well, we're going to have a standard of 0.3, and then because we're in bad economic times, they change it to 0.7, from a lender's viewpoint, that's temporary. It's at some point it's going to come back to 0.3, and so when it does, are you going to default on my debt? And so these are the kinds of questions that have to get answered in financings, and the more money involved, the more sensitivity there is, because the last thing in the world you need as a lender is to lend literally billions of dollars into a project and find out 10 years later you've got to lend 40 more million in order to put on new pollution control equipment. So those are, really briefly, those are the three sort of large areas of what you have to worry about with financing these types of facilities, and it's the reason that you hear some of the concern hear when people talk about these facilities on what they have to overcome. Believe it or not, I'm a lawyer and I'm finished. So, if are there any questions? Yes. Here.
In the last situation you described, where because of the economic situation, for example, there may be a rollback of a permit number, pounds per million BTU emissions level. Have you ever actually seen that done by a state where they've dropped it down? And if they have, and you permit a facility, have you seen those folks trying to do that, do it in a way that says, we will be effectively grandfathered in. We would like to be at that point and not be subject to having it kick back up.
Well, have I seen situations where the government came in and required sort of new criteria in the middle of the game? Yes, Clean Air Act. And so plants had to retrofit. They had to put significant capital improvements in. There's two real, do projects get exemptions? Yes, of course. And whether it's the federal government, the state government, they're not trying to put projects out of business. But they can do it inadvertently, and the other real concern by lenders is politically. When you've got a facility that has a stack, and there's emissions, and you don't qualify with what is the current standard, you are a political nightmare. And so, does the permitting agency shut you down? No. Can the politics shut you down? Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Jay, my name is Dr. Lawrence, and we specialize in government-enhanced financing. I was going to say to you, what was your exposure? You're referencing Wall Street, and we find in our project finance that the Federal Home Loan Bank has been a real partner in renewable energies because it allows banks to do off-balance sheet transactions and issue AAA rated bonds in the marketplace. Have you seen exposure to that? And we also do a lot of USDA guaranteed financing on the RUS side and BNI and REAP. So those are some options that obviously can be available. And Maryland has 17 of its 23 counties that are totally rural, so 74% of its land mass is rural America.
No, absolutely. And RUS is sort of, in terms of real dollars, I think has been a more effective program. I mean, I'm not trying to attack programs, but USDA, there's some very, very large projects that just can't get off the ground. They're like Porsches in neutral. And so it's they're out there, they're working on those programs, but you're not seeing real dollars. And it's one of the things I alluded to, the IFC and the funding that goes with American products overseas is incredibly easy to access and to get your hands on. Unfortunately, if you want to use an American manufacturer project in Maryland, you can't access that money. It has to be overseas. So that's why I said candidly, sometimes it is easier. I'm working on or just finished a project in Ghana. It was literally easier to get financing for that project than the one in Wisconsin.
Some other questions?
Yes, I got it.
You've described utility scale or larger scale projects that the single project has enough total revenue flow to make it attractive for firms like yours to work with it. When you're working with an apartment complex, smaller, single boiler could serve an entire complex with hot water, heat, and cooling, but it's so small in terms of actual dollars for big firms that nobody wants to touch it. How would you propose that that scale project begin to look for financing?
That scale project is going to have to get done with somebody guaranteeing it. I mean, realistically, the economics won't support project finance. You see, for example, we represent Walmart in what they're doing with there's stores all over the country and solar and that sort of thing. So you can see sort of individual stores being done, but they're not being financed individually. You can see apartment complexes you see being done, but typically they're part of REITs, where they're doing it on a much larger scale. So the true standalone shopping center, even the standalone small industrial park that wants to put a facility like this in, is really going to have trouble because the economics aren't there, the guarantee's not there, and you can't project finance it. Fundamentally, the answer is no on that. It's really difficult unless you have a standalone support for it. And so it's difficult unless one of the participants wants to become involved in the equity. A simple fundamental thing, as the more difficult your project is to finance, the more equity it requires, the easier it is to finance. So if you're going to, when I talk about project finance, that's generally 80% debt, 20% equity. If you come to the lender with a 50% debt, 50% equity, you're in a whole different camp. And so you're going to have to increase your equity participation to something closer to 50-50 to get that kind of project financed. And then it's also going to come down to how creditworthy the tenants are, which is another thing that's going to be an issue. Because presumably you're going to recover the money to pay for that system through whoever the tenants are. If you're talking about it, you said an apartment building, that sort of thing. And so the lender's going to be concerned, what are we talking about here? Are these commercial tenants, are these residential tenants, and that sort of thing? And that can get a little tricky if it's residential. Anything else?
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.